Hey everybody, welcome, great to see you. Thanks for being here, North Branch Nature Center. Is this anybody's first time here? Super, well welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Sean Beckett, I'm the program director here at North Branch, and we're excited to welcome you to Naturalist Journeys, our 29th season of this annual winter presentation series. This year the topic is all around forest ecology, in particular this idea of how do we grow healthy and sustainable forests here in Vermont. And so throughout the winter, we're bringing in experts from all kind of different walks of the forestry and forest ecology and forest management world to think about this stuff day in, day out, and learn from them about how they make decisions around, things like how can cutting a tree increase biodiversity in a forest, or when is it best to leave nature to do its own thing to increase resilience, to when is invasive species management the right thing for a forest and when is it not, and how do we think about forests 300 years from now, knowing the information that we have today, and other such questions. So we're in the middle of the series right now. A couple of things I want to kind of announce and let you know about, and some folks to thank before we get into things. First of all, first is thanks for your support of North Branch Nature Center and Naturalist Journeys. If you are already a member of North Branch, thank you. Keep it up. If you'd like to become a member of North Branch Nature Center, we'd love to have you. You can talk with myself or Em after the program. If you'd like to make a donation, there's lots of ways to do that out in the lobby. And thanks to those of you that contributed in the registration for this as well. And that goes for all of you watching the recording and the live stream too. Another couple other things I wanted to announce is in a couple of days, we're going to be unveiling our Biodiversity University series. So consider this an early notice about some really exciting programs that we have coming up this summer. Biodiversity University is kind of our field courses for naturalists. They're typically weekend-long deep dives into topics ranging from, moth taxonomy to nature observation to amphibian ecology to photography to whatever. So just outside in the lobby, there's some flyers that kind of give the whole lineup of the programs that are coming up this summer. But interestingly, we have a couple that I think would be particularly interested to you all. One is a Forestry for Naturalists weekend that is going to be taught by myself and Ethan Tapper in May. And then also the Vermont Nursery and Landscape Association is doing a Gardening for Biodiversity weekend in August. So that plus a whole bunch of other things coming up as well. So check out our Biodiversity University series when you get the chance. Those all start open for registration on Saturday. So with that, I want to thank our sponsors that make Naturalist Journeys possible, our lead sponsors, Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee. I also want to thank our other sponsors, Onion River Outdoors, Stone Environmental, Washington Electric Co-op, and Waite Heindel Environmental. So why don't we give those sponsors a round of applause for making this possible. And please keep it going for Orca Media, who is recording this and live streaming this and making that possible. Thank you, Orca Media. I think that's all the thank yous I have to give. Great. So a couple housekeeping things. We have plenty of time for questions and back and forth and Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions as things come up, please just go ahead and hold them till the end. Plenty of time for that then. So with that, a couple weeks ago we had Alex Barrett here from Longview Forest, and what was interesting is he was talking about his work as an ecological forester and decisions that he's making on the ground. And we kind of finished that discussion thinking about, how do you make management decisions today based on uncertainties that are happening hundreds of years or potentially, totally uncertain things happening decades or centuries from now, which is a perfect lead into today's topic. Today we have Jess Wikle from UVM Research Forest joining us, and very excited to learn about her work and research. So please help me welcome Jess Wikle.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. My first time here. I'm excited to talk about kind of managing forests for that uncertainty. So quick outline of the talk tonight. I'm going to talk about global change in Northeast forests and kind of some of the concerns we have. And then I'll shift into some potential ways we can manage for it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project that examines some of these, and then I'll wrap up and have time for questions at the end. So I wanted to start by introducing myself just with a little bit more detail. So my current role is I am the research forest manager at UVM and also a lecturer in the forestry program. So I teach classes on forest management and on wildland fire. I like to show this picture at every talk I give to be like, I was always meant to be a forester. You know, it's in my blood, but it was kind of a late start for me. I didn't actually start studying forestry until I was in my 20s. I'm from a small town in western Massachusetts called Great Barrington. How many people were here last week? Just out of curiosity. So I grew up like 10 minutes away from Alex Barrett. Now we're both foresters in Vermont. Kind of just a random coincidence. Grew up in a really rural place, but didn't find forestry until my 20s. But when I did, I first worked as a consultant, working with private landowners and water companies, and found myself just having like a lot of questions and curiosity about kind of digging into bigger questions, things you don't necessarily have time for when you're working for a client and making money. So that kind of drove me to go back to school to start studying how trees grow, studying forest ecology. Going back to school led me to go back to more school. That's what brought me to Vermont in 2019, where I came in as a PhD student, specifically studying forest management for climate change adaptation. And then I shifted into the role that I'm in now in 2022. So I like to say I have the best job at UVM. I still get to be a forester, and I get to teach students, and I get to do the research piece. So that's kind of this perspective and background I'm bringing to the talk tonight. But yeah, so there we go. Global change in Northeast forests. The beginning of this talk is like a little bit of a downer. It's kind of doom and gloom. It's like all of the potential possible things that could go wrong with the forest. It's going to come back up again, but just don't get too depressed in the first couple slides. So I like to kind of start the conversation about climate change and forest vulnerability with a brief overview of disturbance. Broadly, disturbance, it shows up as like snowstorms, windstorms, ice storms. In other parts of the world, it's fires, hurricanes, basically anything that kind of disrupts the forest ecosystem, kills some trees. And it's a natural part of forest ecosystems. It's expected. Forests bounce back from those natural disturbances. They also bounce back from human-caused disturbances. This photo sequence on the bottom is timber harvest, so human activity. The first photo on the left is the 1 year after, and then we go 7 years, 14 years, and 24 years. So just kind of a reminder that the disturbance is part of forests. They recover, they bounce back, they shift. But right, especially with things like climate change, we worry that disturbances might be having negative impacts on forests. And what kind of shifts the balance from them being part of the natural cycle to having negative impacts is usually either if something changes to make the ecosystem more vulnerable and the disturbances are the same, but the ecosystem can't bounce back as well, or if the nature of this disturbance changes. And so both of these two facets influence our forests a little bit. And also just a kind of a thing I like to also remind people when I talk about this is the impacts to forests a lot of them are subjective. We as people all have things we want from forests. It could be scenic beauty, it could be wood products, it could be carbon storage, it could be wildlife habitat. But when we think about what our forest is vulnerable to, we tend to have like a human range of values overlaid on that. So complicated stuff. So I'll talk a little bit more about those two things that kind of might make forests more vulnerable. Starting with kind of that baseline vulnerability. So if we go back in time, this is probably familiar to, if you're here at this talk, you probably know something about Vermont forests or care about them. So this map showing kind of how much of the land in the eastern US was cleared of forests 100 years ago is probably familiar. So Vermont included was well forested before settlement, cleared for agriculture, and then has made a pretty spectacular rebound. We're now 78% forested again. That middle photo is from UVM's research forest in Jericho from 1940. It's basically like a sand dune with trees planted in it, and if you walk through it today, it's a forest. So forests have shown this pretty remarkable ability to bounce back, but they're probably not the same as they were before settlement. So in general, they tend to be more even aged. At like a stand scale or local scale, you might have a lot of trees that are close in age to each other, growing near each other. if you zoom out to the landscape scale, you also tend to have, with some variation, a lot of forests tend to be like 80 to 100 years old. And that could mean that these forests are a little bit more vulnerable. They tend to be maybe slightly less diverse in species than they would have been pre-settlement. They might be slightly less what I call structurally complex. It's something I'll talk about more later on, but it means fewer ages of trees, fewer sizes of trees, which also kind of confer vulnerability. And then in the interim, some, although not all forests, have gone through some more short-sighted forest management that could also contribute to vulnerability, specifically management that removed one or two species preferentially, and now they're not on the landscape anymore, or management that didn't take into account things like soil compaction or water quality. So this is how the Northeast forests might kind of have lost or have become more vulnerability, lost some of that resilience. And then the other big piece is kind of the nature of the disturbances changing. This is something that's on a lot of people's radar. It seems like there's always kind of some new issue popping up. And I titled this global change, not climate change, because it is climate change, and it's also the movement of pests and pathogens due to globalization, so it's kind of multiple pieces. Some of the things we think about a lot in the Northeast and in Vermont have to do with temperature and precipitation. I probably don't have to mention heavy rain, right? That's something we've all experienced a lot in the past couple of years. But there are some kind of interesting patterns where we're also having a lot of drought. So there'll be like a long period of drought, and then a heavy rainstorm, and then more drought. So even though it seems like we're getting a ton of rain, there's still this kind of drought stress, and then coupled with like runoff and erosion. So it's kind of an interesting pattern, but something that could be, it's a different disturbance regime than the past, and it could be impacting forests. Another piece is shifts in seasonality. And what I mean by that is like, luckily we haven't had one yet this winter, but those like longer warming events in the middle of the winter when a lot of the snow melts. It seems like every year in the past few years, except for this year, we've had that. That creates things like potential erosion, and it also might create bare soil, which doesn't at base seem like a terrible thing, but the snow usually creates a nice like buffering, comfortable blanket for the ground. Once it's gone, the soil and tree roots actually get colder and they can experience damage. And then also in 2023, we had like a late season frost event that impacted trees. So we had a really warm spring. A lot of trees leafed out a little bit early, and then we had a slightly later than normal frost. And we had a lot of trees that looked like this one, where the leaves died back. So those are just some of the main climate change impacts. Like I said, doom and gloom, but it'll end soon. There's many forest pests that could be of interest here. I spotlighted two on this slide. Spongy moth, parts of Vermont had a significant outbreak about 2020, 2021. It's a defoliating insect. It's invasive, but it's been around for a long time. It's cyclical, but it does tend to do better in dry years, which if we have them, it can cause more damage. And then the last one on your right is beech leaf disease, which is a relative newcomer to Vermont. It showed up for the first time in 2023, but it's been kind of marching its way northward. It's a fairly new to the US forest pest in general. We're still learning a lot about it, but the prognosis isn't good. So there are a lot of potential concerns. I do want to emphasize, like I just mentioned all of this stuff, and it sounds terrible. A lot of this stuff isn't urgent. It's not all happening this year or next year. Some of it's kind of building through time, which builds on that theme of uncertainty and kind of what may be coming down the line in the future. But it's all worth thinking about now. But when we compare it to like some of the ecosystems that are experiencing fire out west, the impacts are like a little bit less time sensitive. But still, like, it does mean that we have time to kind of plan ahead for them. Another fun thing about disturbances is that when they stack up on each other, they tend to have worse impacts on forests. So this diagram on your right, it's like a classic forest pathology diagram called Mannion's decline spiral. And basically, the outer circle is predisposing factors that might make a tree or forest vulnerable, including things like climate change or soil compaction. And then you add to it things like defoliating insects, and drought. And then the inner circle is maybe wood decomposers. And so basically, once these disturbances start stacking up on each other, like drought plus a defoliating insect, if a tree has to like send out new leaves more than once in a year, it eats away at all of its sugar stores and will eventually like starve itself to death. So as these disturbances kind of stack up on each other, that's also more vulnerability. And then one more kind of interesting bit of climate change research that's been done on Northeast forests is this vulnerability assessment. This is modeling work done by the US Forest Service. And basically what they did was they looked at, species all over the country. This is specific to New England, but they looked at each of these species and where they grow best in terms of temperature, precipitation, climate, and kind of defined a climate envelope where those species grow best. And then they modeled what the climate might be like in the year 2100 under a low emissions and high emissions scenario, and tried to parse out whether the ideal habitat for these species might move. So these pluses and minuses aren't saying like this species is going to disappear in 75 years. They're just saying that in 75 years on a high emissions pathway, the growing conditions might be not as great for some of the species that we are familiar with here in Vermont, like American beech, sugar maple, and yellow birch. And the growing conditions might be better for some more southerly species, like northern red oak, black birch, black cherry, hickory. So it's kind of another consideration when we think about managing for an uncertain future, is just what species might grow here in the future if a forest is a primary goal over a forest of specific species. So an underlying concept is in my talk title, and I'll talk more about it, is something called adaptive capacity, which basically describes how well a forest can accommodate or withstand the impacts of one of these kind of novel disturbances I've talked about without it really impacting the function. So the forest goes through that disturbance, but at the end of it, it's still supporting wildlife, it's still supporting decomposers, it's still storing carbon, it's still filtering water. Forests can also go through disturbance and still have trees standing at the end, but not have all of those various ecosystem functions. So a forest with a high adaptive capacity keeps the function. As you might imagine, this is like really hard to measure because you have to wait for that disturbance to happen. So the best way that I can think of to like measure adaptive capacity is to build a time machine, go forward to like 2100, see which forests look the best, and then come back and manage the rest of them that way. But in the meantime, we can't really do that. So we have to kind of come up with maybe proxies for how to assess adaptive capacity. And what a lot of the science shows is that diversity and complexity are kind of the golden ticket. They have a positive impact on adaptive capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that's kind of the path we go down when we think about managing for uncertainty, is to make the forest diverse so it has kind of a lot of options. So forest structure and composition broadly are defined as the species present in the forest. That's the composition. And then the elements of the forest, the trees, the dead trees, the downed wood, those are the structure, and also how they're arranged in space. So not just like how many big trees there are, how many small trees there are, but are they close together? Are they far apart? Are they evenly spaced? All of that goes into forest structure. And so we're aiming for complexity. And here's just a couple bullet points on like how we know that impacts adaptive capacity. So a lot of research points to species diverse forests being better able to withstand drought. In brief, like different tree species access water differently and use water differently and might use water at slightly different times of year, times of day. So if you have a lot of different species, they're better able to make use of the water that's there. Diversity of species and also sizes and ages of trees end up having a big impact on how forests withstand like windstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, ice storms, heavy snowstorms. You know, some tree species blow over more easily. Bigger trees blow over more easily. There are some species of tree that have branches that are more fragile if you get an ice storm or heavy snow and will break off and have damage. So not knowing which of those types of storms you're going to have, if you have a diversity of species, one or the other will be able to hopefully withstand what's coming. Species diversity can also protect against the movement of insect and fungal pests. A lot of insect pests and fungal pathogens can move surprisingly far given how small they are, but many of them are also host specific and maybe can't move as far. So having two trees of different species next to each other can almost create like a physical barrier that makes it harder for that pest to move on to its next host. And then kind of more broadly, complexity leads to a greater number of what are called disturbance recovery pathways, or ways a forest could bounce back from a disturbance. So I have a diagram here that I'm going to walk through slowly to kind of explain what I mean there. So let's see. Imagine this forest on your right is like a pretty like single species forest where all the trees are the same age, close to the same age. And that represents the black dot in the middle here. Each of the arrows is a potential way that forest could bounce back from a disturbance that happens. Whatever species survive and become the new forest. If the arrow stays within that dark shaded circle, after your disturbance, you have a forest that's like healthy and functional, doing all of those great functions that we talked about. If your recovery pathway takes you kind of outside the dark gray into the light gray, maybe you still have trees standing or vegetation on site, but it's not a forest that's kind of healthy and functional and still doing what society asks for it and what maybe the environment needs from it. So this is kind of an illustration of what that might look like. So we have a couple arrows going to that gray area where, in that top one, maybe an insect defoliator pest that's species specific found all of these trees that were the same species and killed all of them. And now you have no trees on site. Or maybe a windstorm came through and blew over all of the trees because they were all the same height. It's still possible you could have a disturbance and it'll stay in that dark gray circle, but there are more pathways that take it into the point where it's just not a healthy or functional forest. Conversely, if you start out with a forest that's diverse, this hypothetical forest in the image has a number of different species, a number of different sizes and ages of trees. And again, it's represented by the black dot. Now you have a lot more arrows, a lot more potential pathways, and a lot more of them stay within kind of that healthy zone of functional forest. And so here's kind of, again, what that situation could look like, where in the example furthest on the left here, maybe that same defoliating pest came through and killed all of the trees of that one species. You still have 2 or 3 other tree species there surviving, and you still have a healthy functional forest. So there are just kind of more options or ways for it to bounce back from disturbance. So I'll move on now to kind of how we manage for this uncertainty. Because again, we're kind of managing for any one of these disturbances or one we haven't even thought about yet. So some general kind of thoughts about it. Management for adaptive capacity. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big change from how we're already managing forests. Adaptive silviculture, adaptive management is a term that, at least in the forestry world, is becoming more and more popular, and it sometimes seems like it connotes some fancy new way of managing forests, and really it's just kind of thinking, reframing things, thinking about things in a different way, making a few decisions in a different way. I also know that Alex talked last week about ecological forestry, and it aligns kind of well with that concept. So ecological forestry is broadly management that more closely emulates natural disturbance history in forests, natural forest development, while still often including management for some timber extraction as a priority. So adaptive forestry, ecological forestry have a lot of overlap. It also overlaps with sustainability. If sustainable forestry is a concept you've thought about or heard about, it's really in line with that. So it's not something brand new. And also there are plenty, there's always a question of management or not management. And there are definitely forests that are that have good adaptive capacity, either through past management choices or because they haven't had a lot of active management. So that is kind of an option when it comes to adaptive capacity. But there are also forests that if you were to leave them without management, they probably wouldn't ever develop on their own into like a complex, diverse forest that has high adaptive capacity. So a couple of photo examples here. On the left, it's a Norway spruce plantation, which is a not invasive, but non-native species that's planted in like a wetland edge that I found. And this forest, you could probably leave it for 100 years. It's not going to get that kind of complexity on its own. Even if some of the canopy trees start to fall down, like there's a thick moss mat that might prevent regeneration of other species. So like this is a site where you almost definitely want to manage for adaptive capacity. The photo on the right is a forest I absolutely love. It's the sugar maple forest. It's rich soils. Every single tree in that photo is sugar maple. It's beautiful. But when you start thinking about adaptive capacity, you could still think that there may be some issues. You know, right now, knock on wood, there isn't a sugar maple specific forest pest. I hope one never makes it to Vermont. But if there were, every tree in that forest could potentially die, and you wouldn't have a seed source, another species seed source nearby. So you're not sure what would happen. So I'm not saying we have to go in and manage the sugar maple forest, but just the question of like when active management should apply is difficult. Sometimes the answer is easy, and sometimes it's not. So I'll be talking about how you can increase adaptive capacity through active management. So a lot of these are pretty simple, straightforward concepts, like simply managing for species diversity, increasing species diversity, and keeping uncommon species on site. So beyond like general diversity, if you happen to be doing active management and there's like 1 or 2 trees that are a species and there aren't more of them on site, it's a really great idea to keep them. It just kind of leaves options open. It's kind of like a diverse stock portfolio, right? It means that if there's a canopy opening somewhere, you've got more species that could seed in and potentially kind of thrive there. Another important piece is kind of retaining or managing for unique structures or structural combinations. So this could be large standing trees, live or dead. It could be large pieces of downed wood. It could be cavity trees. Those are kind of some of the go-tos. But there are also other just kind of combinations, like keeping a conifer and a hardwood tree next to each other might create like a specific unique microhabitat you don't have. Having like trees of different sizes next to each other are things that are kind of less thought of, but that also kind of create little pockets of unique conditions. So this photo on the right is an example of that. It may be kind of hard to see. I took it in a mostly sugar maple forest, but in the spot I was standing looking up, there's a snag, which has kind of a unique value. Up in the top left, there's a big red spruce tree, uncommon in this forest. There are also 4 sugar maples, which are more common. And there's also a yellow birch on the side. So like in that spot, there was kind of a unique combination of a bunch of different tree species. If I had walked like 30 feet to my right, I might have been just surrounded by sugar maple. If I'm thinking about managing, that combination is something unique that isn't everywhere. So kind of looking for those little unique patches or pockets are things that basically having a diversity of little sites like that means that you may have a diversity of fungi, of wildlife species that can use it. So it's like diversity creates more diversity. And then also just keeping healthy trees in the forest. There's obviously a huge benefit to keeping dead trees and keeping live trees with cavities in them for wildlife. But also, as you think about what trees to remove and what trees to keep, a tree that is able to grow really vigorously, is able to put out a lot of leaves, photosynthesize a lot, store a lot of sugars in its roots so that it can recover after a disturbance, is a really good one to leave behind, as opposed to a tree that may die when that first disturbance comes, instead of being able to withstand like the first 3 and bounce back. Also, kind of zooming out to the landscape scale, creating unique features in the forest canopy is a big benefit. So this is image on the right is LiDAR imagery. basically flowing over the forest. So the blue parts are canopy gaps, the orange parts are trees, and they're taller. And so creating canopy gaps in the forest are, again, creating like a unique feature. It's a spot where trees that need more sunlight to grow, that wouldn't have grown under the closed canopy, now have a spot to regenerate. Without creating like a gigantic canopy opening, you're still keeping those species on the site as a seed source for the next disturbance, which means that they can kind of link to other areas of the forest. So having canopy gaps, having reserve patches, having areas that are thin, like having kind of some combination of different management techniques on one site, again, kind of keeps your options open and keeps the forest's options open. You can think about connectivity, both from like a wildlife corridor standpoint or like tree seed transportation corridor standpoint, but also like the juxtaposition of an unmanaged stand next to a managed stand, again, is that landscape scale diversity that keeps options open. Managing for invasive species, I told someone I would mention it once. So it's generally a good thing to think about, like when you're doing active management. Anytime you make one of those awesome canopy gaps, if there are invasive species nearby that can be a seed source, they're going to get there as fast as the trees you want. So if you manage for them proactively, like before doing a timber harvest, coming in and removing some of that seed source, you can hopefully keep them at bay. But there are sites where if you cut any tree and you're going to have like barberry fill in the understory, you don't want to start putting canopy gaps in. You kind of have to think about the bigger picture. Planting is a thing that people do for increasing adaptive capacity. It could be something you do just to increase species diversity on site. If it's hard to get natural regeneration of a tree species that doesn't have a seed source nearby. So planting is a way to change that. And then also, if you think about some of those species ranges that are shifting generally northward, like it's great to know that maybe in 75 years, red oak is going to grow really well in northern Vermont. There isn't a lot of red oak in northern Vermont. There is a little bit. But if you're forward thinking, maybe you want to plant a few more kind of at the northern edge of the tree's range so that in 50 years, in 75 years, in 100 years, it can be there as a seed source to naturally regenerate. There are some downsides to planting also. It's expensive. Deer really like to eat planted seedlings, so it takes some work to maintain them, but it's definitely an adaptive option that people do. And then since I mentioned active management, there's also kind of things you can do while you're doing the management that help with adaptive capacity. So one technique that's becoming more popular is something called contour felling, where you'd fell a large tree on a slope and leave it in the woods, like parallel to the slope, so that if you get heavy rain and runoff, that tree will stop water flow. And as it decomposes, it'll actually like absorb water, and it'll come out slowly. Also, just like retaining dead wood in the forest in general is a great way to kind of mediate some of that water dynamic. Right, like freshly fallen wood doesn't soak up that much water, but decomposing wood does. So it's a way to kind of slow down how fast like water would leave the forest during a drought. And then just generally the Vermont state acceptable management practices that benefit water quality should be followed and help out with just making sure the forest is healthy. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a research project based on these principles, and then we'll get into questions after that. So this project, it was part of my PhD research, but is mostly, the New England part is mostly overseen by Tony D'Amato at UVM. So this is part of a international, North America project looking at adaptive capacity in a bunch of different forest types. I'm just going to talk about northern hardwood forests from a site in New Hampshire, so beech, birch, maple forests. But also across Vermont, Tony D'Amato has put together a number of like smaller satellite sites. I don't have a map of them, but there's some on state forest lands, Nature Conservancy land. There's some at the Silvio Conti National Wildlife Refuge. So there's like a ton of this adaptive management happening in Vermont, which is really cool. So this experiment was kind of designed around a couple different approaches to managing for climate change adaptation, kind of based on how how much you think the climate is going to change, how vulnerable you think your current forest is to that change. So they're presented in here as like 4 discrete options. In reality, like these approaches really do blend together, but for the sake of research, we're like, here are 4 ways you could do it. And one of them is to not do any active management. In the experiment, it was kind of like a control, like let's see how the forest responds to climate change if we don't manage it. As we move into the kind of management zone, there is an experiment or a category called resistance, where you do active management, but in doing so, you try to keep the forest as similar as possible as it is to the way it is right now. So any management is to kind of make sure that the trees that remain in the forest are healthy and vigorous, and that you keep the same species composition, same proportion of maple, same proportion of birch, same proportion of beech. In this case, it was a treatment called single tree selection, where trees were removed individually, and not a lot of them. As we move kind of down that gradient towards maybe wanting to respond to more change, the next treatment was called resilience. So again, that's active management that works to add like a little bit more diversity into the forest, a little bit more structural complexity, but still kind of retain the same general character of the forest. Like it's still going to be a maple, beech, birch forest. It's not going to turn into an oak forest. And that was a treatment that used mostly smaller canopy gaps. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the treatments, but come find me afterwards if you want like all the nitty-gritty details. And then the kind of most extreme treatment, which still isn't like that extreme, is called transition, and that's management kind of working on the idea that things are going to change a lot. Eventually, you want your forest to be pretty different compositionally and structurally than it is today, with the hope that it will better be able to thrive in whatever the climate's going to be like in 50 or 100 years. And I just wanted to, first of all, highlight some of the partners on this work, because I was definitely part of a larger project. And also, I was looking at forest structure. There were also people looking at like birds and insects and decomposers and wood decomposition. So it's a very cool, big project. But also just to kind of reiterate the question and approach here, which is that even with this like really regimented experimental design, we're still not asking like which treatment gives you adaptive capacity or the best adaptive capacity, because we still can't answer that. So the question really was, we know that structural and compositional diversity link to adaptive capacity. What does each treatment do to that structure and composition? So this is just a schematic of the experiment. The circles, the white ones represent canopy gaps, the dark ones represent uncut reserve patches. So just for like a general idea of kind of how much canopy disturbance each treatment had, the light blue is transition, that most extreme treatment. The brown is resilience. The green with lines is resistance. And it was a 400-acre replicated experiment, so it was large. The idea was to have it be like operationally large enough that if another landowner wanted to carry it out, they would have a lot of detail on how to do it, as opposed to being like a very small demonstration area that's good for learning, but not good for learning how to like replicate it somewhere else. And then this is an aerial photo of it. This is infrared imagery, so the trees reflect back red instead of green. They are green in real life. Sorry. I always give my students a hard time if they don't laugh at my jokes, so thank you for laughing at my jokes. So you can see, again, those canopy gaps are kind of apparent. They show up as green. And these black squares are the experimental units. They're each 1 hectare, so 100 by 100 meters, and within that, we mapped the location of every single tree so that we could look at forest structure. It was about 6,000 trees. It took a whole summer. And I'll just talk through a couple of the results because they're interesting. So first we looked at the overstory species composition, the forest canopy. And when I first got the results here, I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like the treatments were supposed to each have a different species composition, right? I said that transition's supposed to be way different and control and resistance are supposed to be really similar. And the forest canopy is almost exactly the same. It didn't change with the management. The reason is that there were just a couple dominant species, and we didn't cut that many trees. We chose to kind of use forest management techniques that are common in this forest type, and because we were also thinking about things like carbon and wildlife, like we didn't want to just like raise every sugar maple and start from scratch. We wanted to actually do kind of like thoughtful ecological type management. So what that means for the experiment and for the long term is that to kind of make these shifts in the forest canopy, you either have to cut more trees early on or come back in 20, 25 years and remove more trees and kind of make it like a gradual shift. So that's probably what they're going to do at this site. But the other piece of the puzzle, right, is that like these two treatments, the canopy didn't change that much, but we had those canopy gaps, so we also have regeneration in the mix. And luckily for me, when we started looking at regeneration, there were some differences among the treatments. The seedlings here are trees that are up to about this tall. Saplings are trees that are like 1 to 4 inches in diameter at that same height. The saplings did not look different among treatments, and that made sense. We took these measurements 5 years after the management. The saplings were growing before the management, so they actually reflect whatever management happened in the forest 20 years prior. When we started looking at the seedlings, luckily, they did kind of diverge from each other, and in ways that generally match with the goals of the experiment. That resistance treatment was supposed to have a really similar composition to the canopy, and it did. It has a lot of sugar maple, like so much sugar maple, a small amount of yellow birch, kind of medium amount of beech, so it matches with the canopy. If we move into resilience, the treatment that's supposed to be like a little bit different, again, we see that kind of coming through. Specifically, there's less sugar maple. This gray category on the bottom that says intolerant hardwoods is a bunch of different species. It's aspen, it's paper birch, ash, cherry, and that group increased in those canopy gaps. So we're seeing a little bit of variation in species composition. And then when we look at transition, we're seeing the greatest shift. There's less sugar maple, there's more of that intolerant hardwood category. We also did plant some seedlings in there. They're not represented in this graph because they weren't a result of natural regeneration, but many of them survived. So obviously the forest will continue to grow. Some of these seedlings will die, but it was a much more promising result in terms of kind of managing to shift the species composition. But what's interesting, and this kind of gets back to the uncertainty on a long timeline, is that the change in climate isn't that noticeable right now. So the species that are not slated to do well in 100 years are still doing fine now. So it makes sense that it was hard to kind of shift the forest away from the equilibrium it's been in. And kind of speaks to the fact that, like, yes, things might change in 100 years, but we can do some management things that might help out with that now, but some of them, like, you kind of have to wait. If you're thinking about a shift in species composition, you can't just plant what's going to grow here in 100 years now, because it's not the climate of 100 years from now. So it was kind of an interesting way to think about it, that we can't make the big changes, but some of the small changes can still happen on this shorter time frame. So these are all of the mapped plots. It's okay if you can't read the legend. It's mostly just to kind of show what they look like. And also, like, I'm proud of my 6,000 trees that I mapped. But I'll talk a little bit more about the analyses we did. But you can see, like, the canopy gaps in transition and resilience are pretty visible. And so even without doing any sort of like fancy spatial analysis, like, you can see that the treatments had different like spatial structural results. The analysis I decided to do was inspired by some research I had seen that had taken place in Montana and Idaho. So take a quick trip over there. These are forest tree stem maps, like the ones I made. But they're in Douglas fir ponderosa pine forest, fire-adapted forest out west, a lot of fire-adapted forest that hasn't had fire in it for a long time. And so the researchers mapped their trees like I did, and tried to kind of pull out specific structural attributes of the forest that related to fire vulnerability. So, they had like these red areas, which are canopy gaps, where there are no trees. Those are good in a fire adapted ecosystem because fire won't burn through them in the same way, but they also could have potential negatives in that it's very hot and dry there, so new trees won't grow. You might have snow melt faster in the spring, which you might not want if you're thinking about like water runoff. So they're valuable, but you wouldn't want your whole area to be open. And then you have these clumps and clusters of trees, and those are maybe not great if you're worried about the spread of fire, because a hot fire would go right through them, but they are a spot where it's shady, where maybe wildlife could hang out. They might be like a place a tree seedling could get some refuge from the hot baking sun. So they're also valuable, but like really what you want is a landscape that has some of everything so that it, one, doesn't all burn in a fire, and two, kind of supports the ecosystem functioning that you want. So I kind of said, well, we can do the same thing in northeastern forests. Like we're not worried about fire in northern Vermont and New Hampshire, but still a closed canopy reserve like the one on top is really beneficial, that it can maintain the same structure and forest structure and composition you have now into the future. It's also could potentially have negative issues, like you could have drought vulnerability because you have a lot of trees close together. You could maybe have a corridor for a forest pest to move through. So again, we want closed canopy forests on the landscape, but we also know it has climate vulnerabilities. We like these canopy gaps. They're great for regeneration. You get age class diversity on the landscape. They support wildlife habitat, but you don't want the whole area to be open because you might not be able to get trees to grow in there, or it might be an opening where invasive plant species could come. So we want to, from an adaptation standpoint, have like multiple of these values on the landscape. So these are the stem maps kind of styled like the ones from the western forests, where the black background indicates like how far you are from another tree. And so it really highlights some of the kind of spatial structural differences among these treatments. And some things that were interesting are really the canopy gaps. So resilience had small, the canopy gaps were like 1/10 of an acre and a half acre, or a quarter acre, so pretty small. But you could stand in the middle of one and be 15 meters away from another tree. That's like a unique condition that's valuable from an adaptation standpoint. The canopy gaps in transition were 1 acre, so larger, but intentionally the forest management left trees behind, called biological legacies. The idea is that they would like ameliorate harsh growing conditions. They might be there as a seed source. They might support like a unique mycorrhizal fungal partner. So even though you have a much larger canopy gap, you actually can't physically get as far away from a single tree if that's your goal. So the treatments end up having like really unique structural conditions, each one of them, which is pretty exciting. And another interesting piece, this is mostly numbers you don't really have to look at. It tells you how many trees are in each hectare in the plot. But what's really interesting to me is the resistance and the resilience have statistically the exact same number of trees in them, and statistically almost the exact same amount of above ground biomass in them. So if you're doing management where you have like a limit to how many trees you want to cut in a harvest, or you're thinking about like how much carbon you're taking out of the forest, you could take out the exact same amount of biomass and have this spatial pattern or this spatial pattern. So you can make like a conscious decision to manage for more structural diversity without maybe compromising on other goals that are important to you. So the main kind of question was with these treatments, or a main question was like, okay, well, each one has its own specific maybe pros and cons. So what do I do with this information? And I like to bring it back to this diagram because I think it's a useful way to think about it. Is that resistance treatment would be great at a site where you have like a really unique forest type that you really don't want to transition away from. So you manage, do what you can to keep the most like healthy trees in that area, keep it the same for as long as possible, or you manage an area where it seems like climate change impacts will be lesser. But if you applied resistance at a site that had like really extreme climate change impacts, it might not work, right? You might not keep the species you want to. A transition is like the opposite end of that spectrum. That's a great approach to take if you know that things are going to change and you want to direct it as opposed to just letting it happen. You want to be somewhat in control of like what species are there, try to minimize negative impacts to forest function. But it may not be appropriate everywhere, and it may not be appropriate on sites like the one I showed you, where it seems like the forest isn't ready yet. You know, it really wants to be the same forest type it's been for a long time, as much as the forest can want. And that resilience approach, just like adding a little bit of diversity, like shaking it up a little bit, using some of those strategies I outlined seems like a really good way to kind of think about splitting the difference. Like if you aren't sure, that's a great way to be like, okay, I'm taking a couple steps in the right direction. Trees live for a long time. There's a long time where we're not going to fully know what's going to happen. So it's a little bit conservative, but also kind of sets you up to move towards new conditions. Yeah, so to wrap things up, despite the doom and gloom, I told you you'd forget about it by the end, right? There are many kind of potential activities you can take to flex the forest towards the future and to start thinking about managing for uncertainty. The best strategies focus pretty broadly on diversity and complexity, and they also really need to be adapted to specific sites, specific conditions, and specific management objectives. Like that's the best way they'll be successful. And that's the end, so I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
All right, so I'm wondering about, you have an even age forest. It seems like one that would be, all the trees are the same height, one that would be very vulnerable to impacts from climate change, particularly like a big blowdown or something like that. And so the treatment is to create a patch cut, which mimics a blowdown, which you're going to get anyway from the climate, the climate-induced disturbance. So I'm wondering how you dovetail forward-thinking management treatment that's mimicking natural disturbances, while also taking into account that there are going to be more of those exact kinds of natural disturbances in a forest. And so how do you gauge, how heavy do we go in this management, knowing that we're actually going to see an increase in the types of disturbances that we're trying to mimic? That makes sense?
It does. Yeah, it's a really tricky question because you don't know if that the hypothetical blowdown is coming next year or in 20 years. And it's not. I don't know that you're always trying to preclude the disturbance, the natural disturbance, but I think of it as you can by doing that forward-thinking planning, you can take a little bit of control over the outcome. If you have this even-aged forest and there happens to be invasive species around the outside, if that blowdown happens, it may be too late for you to pre-manage the invasive species and keep them from coming in. So, but if you manage a harvest that mimics a blowdown while also managing the invasive species, you've controlled the outcome of that a little bit, if that makes sense. And also, all right, I lost my train of thought on that one also. But yeah, I really think you have to manage for the uncertainty without managing for the specific uncertainty is another way I would think about it, is you shouldn't just be managing that site for a potential blowdown, but maybe you're also worried about a pest outbreak and also an ice storm. And so you're just kind of removing some of the uncertainty of what will happen with that uncertain disturbance, I guess. That's the way I think about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Openings and patches. Why does it seem like the American beach comes back so quickly and thickly?
Because it does.
Okay.
Next question. Okay. So beach has an interesting, American beach specifically has some interesting regeneration tactics. It will regenerate through the nuts. It really likes to sprout through its roots. And it has a specific response to, many trees you'll see sprout from their stumps if you cut them, but most of them don't also sprout out of their roots. Beech sprouts out of its roots, and also if its roots are disturbed, it sprouts out of them more. So if you drive over a beech root during the growing season, it'll sprout next year. So that disturbance caused by the harvest, depending on what time of year you do the harvest, will just cause the roots to sprout. If you do like a winter harvest, or with like snow on the ground as a buffer, you can limit some of that. But also beech has beech bark disease is impacting it, and that is a disease that tends to kill mature beech trees. And when the big tree dies, they send all of their resources back down to their roots and root sprout. So it's really, even if you manage the ground conditions perfectly, it would still be root sprouting. And then once you add in kind of the extra sunlight you get from the canopy gap, it sprouts more. And if you think about, if you put in a canopy gap, you already have beech roots present, and then you have, say, birch seeds that blow in from somewhere, which is oftentimes what happens. The beech is growing out of the root system from a whole tree, whereas your brand new seedling of birch that just blew in is sending down roots for the first time. So the beech can grow like 5 times as fast. It doesn't have to like grow a root system and gather sugars the same way a brand new seedling would. So it's like really well set up to grow faster and shade out a bunch of the other stuff. So a lot going on.
So intensely, I mean, in terms of other species that might then not be able to grow as well, should that beech just be treated in any way, or just let it go and let the other species that may be coming in catch up and take over?
It can definitely be a problem, depending on where you are. It tends to do better on like sites with lower quality soil, for example. But there are definitely forest managers who will treat beech almost like an invasive species. Like they'll come in after a harvest and you might herbicide it, or you might mow it or brush saw it. And a lot of times you're not trying to eradicate it. Like I hope you wouldn't, like, even though it's annoying, it's a native species, but just like knocking back its growth long enough that some of the other stuff can get taller. And so the end result is that like you have a lot of beech on site, but you also have other trees, versus having the same amount of beech with no other trees. So it's been fairly common to manage for it. I'm not sure how beech leaf disease is, well, I have some ideas how beech leaf disease is going to change that, but for the time being, if you have a canopy gap that's mostly beech, it's not very biodiverse, so it is worth thinking about. It doesn't have to be herbicide. It can be like cutting or macheting or whatever tool of choice. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you give us an idea how you map your trees in each hectare? Is that super labor intensive, or is there software that you use?
So you can do it with software, like that LiDAR image I showed you probably could be used to map it. We did it in a pretty labor-intensive fashion. So we basically, like a graph has an x-axis and a y-axis, we basically laid out 100-meter tape measures and made an x and y-axis. And then we would do every 10 meters another kind of north-south tape measure. And then within that 10-meter wide by 100-meter long strip, we mapped the location of every tree with a tape measure. And we put tags on them so that you can revisit the site and measure how things change. But yeah, it was, by the end of the summer, 3 of us could do 1 hectare in like a 10 to 11 hour workday. But at the beginning of the summer, it took 4 of us like 3 days to do it. So it's a lot of, like, we were using like a compass to lay out the tape measures, and the research site was pretty steep, so we had to use a hand clinometer and do slope calculations to make sure that our distances were correct. It was wild. It may be more fun than it sounds like, but it was also like, it felt really good when it was over too,
I'm curious the scale of the forest size that you think about applying some of these models. Like, you are obviously working in a fairly large forested area, especially around here. Like, a lot of the forest is more fragmented. And what scale are you looking at, and when you're sort of making these determinations?
Yeah, a lot of them can be applied at any scale. I mean, some of the things can, like. Things like managing for species diversity, like if I have 8 trees in my backyard, I would probably make sure they were all different species. Like there are things you can do at a small scale, but like obviously if you're like live on a half-acre house lot, you're not going to do a 1/4 acre canopy gap cut, right? But I mean, I tend to kind of think that no scale is too small, really. I manage 800 acres for UVM, but I would manage like as few as 5 acres at once. I tend to kind of think that like every little bit helps. So I do think this could be easily applied to like a town forest, a park, someplace with not a lot of forest land. But when you start thinking about like the landscape scale, age class diversity, you can't do that on a small scale. But I would think there are like pieces you can do at any scale.
Along that same topic, it's an opportunity to consider beyond your own borders. If your neighbor's managing for a sugar bush, you might choose to do something different just because you know there's plenty of sugar bush seed stock there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are really cool opportunities to do that scale of management. I mean, it requires like neighborly cooperation, but I think it opens up a lot of opportunities if people are willing to work together. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sure it'll vary depending on the site conditions, but are there particular tree species that you think are good candidates for like transition kind of management?
Yeah, so that table I showed at the beginning with like the vulnerability mapping, red oak is like so far slated to, it's very drought resistant. It grows, it has like a really well-developed root system. That's one of the kind of like climate winners. So that's often part of planting. Let's see, black birch is also kind of on that list. Like it has a lot of similarities to yellow birch. So like if yellow birch's habitat range shrinks, black birch could fill like some of that niche. Other eastern white pine is kind of on the list as a potentially good species. There are a couple other more southerly species that might do well but haven't done well in planting. Like bitternut hickory has been planted in a bunch of these adaptive research sites, and I think they just don't take well to being planted. Like they have really deep roots, and so you get nursery stock, and if you don't plant them right. So that's a tricky question. Like maybe if they were naturally regenerating, they do really well, but we haven't had as much luck moving them. But yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I was showing you on that graph. Basswood actually is supposed to do well, which is surprising because it doesn't grow like prolifically anywhere, you know. But yeah, those are a few. And another thing people are kind of thinking about is like there's something called functional traits, which I won't get into too much detail there, but kind of like if you're losing an important value on the landscape, replacing it. So like we're concerned about losing beech because of beech bark disease and beech leaf disease. Beech is a nut producer, which has a ton of value for wildlife. So when we think about maybe bringing in species to plant, we would want to plant another nut producer like oak or American chestnut if there was blight-resistant variety. So some of that kind of like planting assisted migration piece is saying like what can we use to replace this? Like is red spruce vulnerable? Should we try planting hemlock, which is also vulnerable? But kind of thinking about filling in like empty spaces, like niche spaces on the landscape. Yeah, go ahead.
Thinking about the deer that like to eat our trees so much, what of those species that you just mentioned, what would be trees that would be good to plant if you know you've got a lot of deer in the woods? Like, do they eat oak?
They do. They love oak, unfortunately. It's tricky. I mean, I'm trying to think of what actually does well. They eat oak a lot. They're hit or miss on black birch. They seem to not eat it as much like in further south, like southern New England, like Connecticut where I used to work. But I think further north they sometimes do. So there are like these weird patterns. They don't really like to eat cherry. But a lot of these planting projects that happen involve deer protection. Like usually it's like those like white mesh cages that are like this tall. And once the tree gets above about this height, it starts to be taller than deer want to eat from. So that works. If you get further north and you're in deer and moose country, it's harder because moose browse stuff up to like this tall, so it's hard to fence it. But yeah, really to be successful, most of these plantings have to involve some sort of deer protection, which is tricky.
How if you're planting oak or releasing oak seedlings or something, humans tend to have a tendency to want to clean things up.
Yeah.
If you leave the mess there, deer really don't like wading through. It used to be in the contracts, you tell your forester or your logger, I want everything lopped to within a foot of the ground.
Yeah.
If it's trunks and brambles and stuff sitting this high, it's a great way for a deer to break a leg if they have to flee through the middle of something like that. So you can protect and get it above that.
Yeah, absolutely. Although downside is trying to plant through that stuff.
Yeah.
But yes, but absolutely, you can probably split the difference if you plan well. Go ahead. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about fire in New England? I know we're not considered fire susceptible. Yeah, we've had huge forest fires to the south and now even in New York. So I'm just wondering how that's playing into your thoughts about adaptability in the future.
Yeah. This year was a crazy fire year. If you look back in history, fire was probably more common in Vermont than we think it was, but also like really site specific. Like there are even this far north, there are like south facing slopes and ridges that have fire adapted species. I mean, like I think there's a hilltop in Bolton called Resin Ridge that has red pine growing on it that is probably there because there was fire. So a little bit of fire has always been here. What we saw this fall, to my knowledge, was mostly in kind of more of the oak forest type than like the maple forest type. So this isn't to say that like the maple forest couldn't burn, but there are some like really interesting just like structural features of these forests that make forests with a lot of oak more likely to burn. For example, like when maple trees fall on the ground, they like flatten out and turn into a wet mat. When oak leaves fall on the ground, they kind of curl up a little bit, which means you get oxygen and airflow, so they'll ignite more easily. So a lot of it is going to be site-specific, species-specific. I mean, if we talk about oak being a climate winner, maybe in 100 years, if there's a lot more oak, some of the sites that now have maple and are less likely to burn would be more likely to burn. But despite last year's fires, I don't think that we're in danger of having like massive forest fires in New England. Like there are a lot of like very specific conditions that lead to it. But it is, I think we're used to not seeing any of it. And I think if we were here like 500 years ago, we'd see more than we expect that we would see. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned carbon capture as an objective earlier. I'm wondering if there's anything aside from like forest density that plays into that. Like if there are any of these management strategies that kind of help with that more. Yeah,
I mean, the best way to have the most carbon in the forest like right now is to grow it really dense and not cut any trees, and to grow big trees. I think if you start taking like a longer term gaze on it, that's not always the best recipe for like the health of the forest in the long term. So some of these strategies I think of as more of like a long term, like you do a harvest now, there's less carbon in the forest today, but you jump forward 50 or 75 years and maybe that very dense forest that has all of the carbon now doesn't have as much carbon, but the site where we managed and had a dip in carbon now has more. So that kind of diversity on the landscape piece I think is important, is that growing all the forest like as thick as possible right now is a great way to have all the carbon right now, but it's not the best like long-term solution because trees die and things happen in the forest, and getting yourself set up to have kind of healthy long-term forests is a better way to have like steady carbon throughout time. But if you're thinking about kind of like small adapting management, things like those large canopy gaps with retention trees in them, like keeping a few more big trees in the forest can help you just like keep a little bit more carbon in the forest even as you're doing management that takes them out. But I don't think like all the carbon today is like the right answer to all the carbon in the forests in the long amount of time, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
Your two charts that have the seedlings and sapling regeneration, dependent on like which management practice. Did you do? It seems like most of those practices were the removal of larger trees, but I guess how much management in those four different things of seedlings or sapling regeneration did you do? Does that make sense?
Like how many trees did we remove? Or?
Well, like how many
Did you remove saplings as well?
Yeah. Were these methods removing saplings or managing seedling regeneration in any other way?
So there was no like intentional sapling removal, and the harvesting method was chainsaws, so it wasn't like you had equipment with a saw that was buzzing things down. But definitely, like as you cut down trees, you drive over some regeneration on like the access roads. But I think that like that impact was pretty minimal. Like if you look at, let's see if I can get back there. Oops, there we are. Like especially because the no action treatment where no equipment drove has like the same amount of saplings as where we did drive. That makes me think that, you know, saplings, especially beech saplings, if you drive over them, they can pop back up and resprout. So I would say like any impact of that is pretty minimal.
And then I was going to ask what happened in between the seedling regeneration that caused that resistance, which seemed to be less management, manipulation of the transition, but yet there was so much more seedlings and resistance.
Yeah, so a couple different things. One, the year they did the harvest was like a really good seed year for sugar maple. It just like they had mass years kind of like oak, like not quite as intense. So there was a lot more sugar maple regeneration that year. Sugar maple grows really well in the shade. And this was closed canopy and still very shady. So a lot of this regeneration was in those canopy gaps, and sugar maple, I think, just got kind of outcompeted by some of the other stuff. Whereas here, obviously the beech could grow, but like yellow birch needs more sunlight to grow. So the sugar maple just had less competition. So it's kind of a combination. And like if you break this down by the data, this was just like 4 plots out of 200 that had like 100 seedlings in it. So it was kind of patchy, but once you average them all together, that we lost some of that. So it ended up being like a little bit site specific.
Yeah, you mentioned American chestnut briefly, and I've been kind of watching that and hoping, I keep thinking, well, maybe next year it'll be the ultimate blight resistant. If they come up with something that's blight resistant, is that a good candidate for, I mean, my impression was that a lot of Vermont was sort of on the fringe of its range, and maybe it won't be because it's warm.
So actually, a lot of the planting experiments that go along with this have included chestnut. So I'm not directly involved with those, but I'm part of the same general lab group. And they've done surprisingly well, even further north, with the late season frost, both in 2023 and also a couple of years earlier. They had some dieback, like they're susceptible to winter injury kind of, but like where they've been able to start growing, they're doing all right. So I think they would definitely they go into that like functional niche of like seed producing species, and they're like a lot more similar to beech than oak is in terms of kind of like if beech sleep disease really knocks back beech and we're looking for a functional replacement, chestnut honestly seems better than oak, So it's definitely a viable option, especially if temperatures warm a little bit. It's hard to say what's going to happen with a blight-resistant variety. There was a whole kerfuffle they were using a GMO variety for a while, and then there was a mislabeled lab specimen, and they lost years of progress. So there's a lot more work going into breeding at this point, which is promising, but it takes a while to do a cross, wait for those trees to get old enough to do another cross. But the progress is incremental, but I don't know. Maybe I'm overly optimistic or hopeful. It's not going to happen like this year or next year, but there's still progress happening, and I'm hopeful. And it's getting planted a lot, and some of those trees will live old enough to produce nuts. So we'll see. Maybe something will happen from one of those back crosses that we don't expect.
What does intolerant hardwoods mean? Why intolerant?
So they are shade intolerant, which means that they only grow in the sun, pretty much. So yeah, that was shorthand I didn't explain, so sorry about that. But yeah, they're specifically species you wouldn't find in the closed canopy forests.
I think we'll wrap things up here. Feel free to stick around and chat a little bit if you'd like to. But thanks very much, Jess, and thanks for